What if one of the largest land empires ever recorded didn't fall in war, but was quietly written out of history? For centuries, maps, encyclopedias, and official records pointed to a vast region called Tartaria, yet today it barely exists in mainstream discussion. Was this simply a misunderstanding of geography, or something more deliberate? The evidence is strange, the questions uncomfortable, and the silence even more so. From vanished names on maps to unexplained architectural patterns, a growing number of researchers are beginning to challenge the accepted narrative. If Tartaria was real, then its disappearance may reveal far more about power, history, and who decides what we remember. Mapping the lost Eurasian Empire. A landmass the exact size of the entire Asian continent does not simply vanish without a trace from the collective memory of human civilization. Yet, when we closely examine the standardized timeline presented by modern mainstream academia, an entire geopolitical expanse has been systematically erased. It has been replaced by institutional hand-waving and a baffling lack of curiosity regarding the physical evidence. For over 600 years, European and American maps prominently featured the Grand Tartary as a sweeping, unified region stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, and from the Arctic down to the borders of China and India. The sudden erasure of this vast territory from our atlases represents a deliberate cartographic vanishing act that demands intense scrutiny. The origins of the name itself are deeply embedded in strict historical records, not mere myth. Chinese texts from the Tang dynasty, spanning the years 618 to 907, and the subsequent Song dynasty, from 960 to 1279, explicitly document northern nomadic tribes inhabiting the steppes. Following the 13th century Mongol invasions of Russia and Central Asia, Islamic and Persian chronicles frequently referred to the mounted warriors of Genghis Khan as Tatar. When formal accounts of these sweeping conquests finally reached Europe, the continent was gripped by a profound existential dread. Western cartographers and scholars, attempting to process the sheer scale of the invading forces, deliberately added an extra letter R to the name. They transformed Tatar into Tartar, intentionally drawing a phonetic and psychological connection to Tartarus, the abyss of hell in ancient Greek mythology. This linguistic shift reveals how deeply the European psyche was scarred by the unimaginable power of the East. Far from being a vague or mythical placeholder, Tartaria was meticulously documented by the most respected mapmakers of their respective eras. The renowned Catalan Atlas and the map of Fra Mauro both clearly delineate its borders with surprising precision. By 1570, Abraham Ortelius published Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, which included a dedicated, highly detailed map depicting the region as a cohesive entity. This undeniable cartographic legacy persisted for centuries without serious challenge. The first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, published in 1771, explicitly defines Tartaria as a massive, unified region, complete with its own distinct sovereign flags and crests. It was recognized globally as a formidable presence on the world stage, not merely an empty expanse of ice and scattered nomads. Then, the systematic dismantling of this history began. As the 19th century progressed, a highly coordinated effort by rising imperial powers effectively fragmented and wiped the name from the globe entirely. The immense territory was carved into administrative zones that perfectly suited the expansionist goals of the era. Great Tartary was quietly absorbed and aggressively rebranded by the Russian Empire as Siberia. Little Tartary, encompassing the fertile lands of the Crimean Khanate, was officially dissolved and is now known as southern Ukraine and Crimea. Chinese Tartary, once a vast northeastern territory, was partitioned and absorbed into what we now recognize as Manchuria and Mongolia. The methodical renaming of these vast regions represents a profound historiographical shift. It is a calculated historical erasure that ultimately transformed a massive, undeniably documented physical reality into a completely forgotten footnote for modern society. Decoding the Antiquitech architectural signature. Look around your own city. You are likely surrounded by massive, hyper-complex neoclassical buildings that seem wildly out of place for the horse and buggy era in which they were allegedly built. Consider how a unified, globally synchronized architectural style appeared simultaneously in newly settled frontier towns like San Francisco and Melbourne, alongside ancient imperial capitals like St. Petersburg. Mainstream historians will confidently tell you this entire phenomenon is simply the rapid global diffusion of the neoclassical movement. They claim an elite network of architects primarily trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris essentially copied and pasted these designs across the globe to serve as the apparatus of the colonial state. They want you to believe that identical courthouses, post offices, and massive state asylums were built worldwide using only rudimentary tools just to project authority and cultural sophistication. But look much closer at the physical structures themselves. The alternative hypothesis, frequently referred to as Antiquitech, suggests these buildings were never just passive shells for local bureaucrats, but rather active components of a lost atmospheric energy grid. This concept is deeply grounded in absolute scientific reality, not science fiction. In 1861, the pioneering physicist Lord Kelvin recognized the immense electrical potential of the Earth and invented the water dropper electrograph to constantly and accurately measure the atmospheric potential gradient. Both historical and modern baseline measurements confirm a staggering reality. The atmosphere functions as a colossal, highly charged electrical condenser, maintaining a continuous potential difference of approximately 300,000 volts between the highest layers of the ionosphere and the ground. Proponents of Antiquitech argue that the defining features of these grand buildings had a highly specific functional purpose directly designed to harvest this massive ambient charge. Those towering metallic spires and intricate finials crowning every roof were not mere ornamental flourishes or basic lightning rods, but highly engineered conductive antennas pulling atmospheric ions downward. Similarly, the massive, perfectly proportioned onion domes found across Eastern Europe and Asia were not built merely for historical prestige, but functioned as precise resonant cavities for massive frequency amplification. This concept of highly advanced, forgotten engineering is actively being validated by modern academic research. Scientists at McGill University recently investigated the lost ventilation systems of Montreal Royal Victoria Hospital, originally constructed in 1893. By studying the original architectural schematics, they uncovered an incredibly sophisticated thermosiphon system integrated directly into the fabric of the partition walls and floors. This massive stone hospital effectively utilized advanced ventilation heat recovery to preheat outdoor air during brutal Canadian winters, and it operated entirely without mechanical fans or modern electrical grids. Those 19th century builders possessed a deep, non-linear understanding of environmental engineering that simply does not fit the accepted academic narrative of strictly linear technological progress. We are living inside the physical remnants of a vastly superior global infrastructure that was marginalized and deliberately stripped of its primary conductive elements. Think about that for 1 second. Unearthing the Great Mud Flood. Take a walk down the oldest streets in your city and look closely at the foundation level of the grandest buildings. You will immediately notice physical anomalies that completely defy common architectural logic. Massive, heavily ornamented structures feature walled-up doors leading nowhere and elaborate windows sitting precisely at ankle height. Proponents of the Tartarian collapse narrative point to these submerged fenestrations as absolute physical proof of a cataclysmic mid-19th century event known as the Great Mud Flood. They argue that the official historical record simply relabeled the original first floors of a global civilization as mere basements after they were buried under several feet of sudden sediment. Closely look at the sheer quality of the masonry on these buried levels. Absolutely no sane builder would sink such intricate, highly expensive stonework directly into the dark dirt. Mainstream historians and professional architects strongly push back against this narrative, with heavily documented institutional explanations for these bizarre structural realities. They argue that these lower levels were entirely intentional daylight basements designed specifically to provide crucial light and ventilation to cold cellars used for storing coal and perishables long before the invention of modern refrigeration. Building into natural slopes often necessitated split-level designs where the lower masonry was drastically thickened to act as a massive retaining wall against lateral soil pressure. Furthermore, in many European contexts, those blind or bricked-up windows were not buried by mud but were a strategic, desperate response to the draconian British window tax enforced between 1696 and 1851. Homeowners deliberately sealed their own openings to avoid paying crushing taxes on natural light and air. The most compelling counterargument to the mud flood theory lies in the staggering reality of 19th-century urban regrades. The late 19th century photographic records showing deep trenches around finished buildings are constantly cited as excavation photos revealing buried Tartarian floors. However, these images actually document colossal civic engineering projects where the ground level of entire cities was radically altered to resolve critical infrastructure crises. The massive Seattle regrade, spanning from 1897 to 1930, saw entire hills leveled and streets raised a full story to facilitate commerce. Even more astonishing was the response to catastrophic drainage and cholera outbreaks in Chicago during the 1850s. The entire metropolis literally raised itself directly out of the deep, muddy swamp. The Tremont House Hotel, a massive 6-story brick building, was lifted 6 feet straight up into the air. A highly coordinated team of 500 men manually turned 5,000 jack screws in perfect unison, lifting the entire structure so smoothly that guests continued sleeping soundly inside. Redrawing the Eurasian continental map. The mid-19th century is now universally celebrated by mainstream academics as a golden era of technological progress and diplomatic maturity. Yet beneath this highly polished narrative lies a much darker reality of massive administrative synchronization and deliberate cultural erasure. This was the precise moment when the sprawling territory of Grand Tartary was systematically deleted from existence, not by a physical cataclysm, but by the relentless stroke of a diplomatic pen. The rapid shrinking of this massive region on international maps is frequently dismissed as merely a natural evolution of improved cartography. However, a rigorous analysis of the geopolitical landscape reveals a very highly coordinated effort to legitimize new, expansionist empires by completely erasing the historical memory of the original native inhabitants. This aggressive historical erasure was primarily driven by the geopolitical conflict known as the Great Game. This was an intense, decades-long strategic rivalry between the expanding British Empire and the Russian Empire, both vying for absolute economic and military control over the heart of Central Asia. This fierce competition for dominance forced the rapid and rigid demarcation of previously fluid borders, aggressively replacing ancient, deeply rooted nomadic territories with hard, militarized lines drawn by foreign bureaucrats. Simultaneously, the once mighty Qing dynasty was facing near total internal and external collapse. Severely weakened by the devastation of the Second Opium War and the horrific internal bloodshed of the Taiping Rebellion, the Chinese government was forced to the negotiating table. They were compelled by direct military threat to sign a series of devastating agreements known to history as the unequal treaties. The sheer scale of the land transfers legally executed during this period is genuinely staggering. In 1858, the signing of the Treaty of Aigun legally ceded over 600,000 square kilometers of prime territory. a region formerly recognized worldwide as Chinese Tartary, directly to the expanding Russian Empire. This massive, unprecedented land grab created the administrative region we now recognize today as Outer Manchuria. Just 2 years later, the 1860 Convention of Peking confirmed these massive territorial gains and completely ceded the vital Ussuri region to Russia, permanently sealing off Chinese naval access to the Sea of Japan. These events were not merely routine administrative adjustments or border corrections. They were the highly calculated legal mechanisms used to formally absorb sovereign Tartarian lands into rigid Russian and Chinese provincial systems. What followed this geopolitical carve-up was a ruthless statistical shift in global nomenclature. Once these highly aggressive treaties were formally signed, the ancient name of Tartary was actively scrubbed from official diplomatic use forever. The vast expanse previously documented on every atlas as independent Tartary was aggressively broken down, completely partitioned, and rebranded into the heavily administered imperial zones of Russian Central Asia and Xinjiang. This systematic renaming process was the ultimate history wipe. By intentionally changing the international maps and demanding total global compliance, the expanding imperial powers successfully delegitimized an entire sovereign culture and its people. The institutional erasure of history. If you wanted to hide an empire, how would you do it? The suppression of this sprawling Eurasian superpower relies heavily on the deliberate standardization of history by scientific and geographical institutions. This was a process of calculated academic gatekeeping rather than innocent scientific advancement. The 1870s marked a critical turning point in international geography and global administrative synchronization. During the First International Geographical Congress held in Antwerp in 1871, a highly destructive global mandate known as the Local Names Policy was formally initiated. This sweeping decree ensured that all maps produced for international use would suddenly align strictly with the administrative reality of controlling states like Russia, China, and Britain. It fundamentally prioritized the immediate political desires of powerful conquering empires over the deep cultural labels successfully utilized by previous generations of independent cartographers and mapmakers. This institutional hand-waving accelerated during the 1890s with the development of the International Map of the World. Editorial decisions made by these elite cartographic committees prioritized contemporary navigational conformity over historical continuity. Within a single decade, the 600-year-old designation of Tartary was completely removed from all standard reference works. This highly deliberate editorial choice created a profound historical amnesia where previously common global knowledge became entirely obscure within just 2 short generations. Simultaneously, the physical evidence of this prior civilization was systematically removed from public circulation. Older maps and manuscripts detailing the vast boundaries of the realm were transferred into restricted special collections at major institutions like the Library of Congress and Purdue University. Authorities claim these documents are held in secured, climate-controlled storage solely due to their physical fragility and immense monetary value. Yet deliberately placing the only surviving physical proof of a unified global order tightly behind locked institutional doors severely deters outside independent research. The most surprising evidence of this systematic incuriosity and active suppression is found within a declassified 1957 intelligence report officially designated as CIA RDP 78. This document details a brutal Soviet directive issued on August 9, 1944. The order commanded the Tatar Provincial Committee to perform a rigorous scientific revision of regional history. The explicit goal was to liquidate serious shortcomings of a nationalistic character and enforce strict ideological conformity. This sweeping mandate was part of a much broader, highly aggressive campaign to suppress ancient regional epics and erase the cultural memory of the native populations. By mandating a strict scientific revision of the deep past to suit their present needs, the controlling academic authorities successfully deleted the physical remnants of a truly formidable global presence, proving once again that recorded history is always carefully curated by victors. Echoes of the Siberian Steppe. When bureaucratic institutions systematically burn the written records of a fallen empire, the truth often survives embedded deep within the oral traditions of the native populations. The vast cultural memory of the Eurasian steppes remains incredibly rich, with legends of ancient, highly advanced builders and terrifying planetary-scale disasters. Mainstream anthropologists frequently dismiss these enduring narratives as simple, primitive fairy tales. However, alternative historians boldly argue these stories are actually heavily distorted historical records of a sudden mass cataclysm. The ancient oral traditions among the Yakut and Buryat peoples of Siberia speak very specifically of a glorious previous era that abruptly fell to terrifying fire from the sky and a devastating flood of earth. This is not merely vague mythology. The Buryat flood myth explicitly describes a massive deluge sent by the god Burkhan to violently cleanse the realm. In this specific narrative, a chosen man was instructed to build a great ship to save the global fauna. Yet the mighty prince of animals, definitively described in these legends as a mammoth, arrogantly considered itself far too large to ever drown, and was subsequently destroyed by the rapidly rising sludge. Proponents of the Tartarian collapse directly link this specific ancestral memory to the very real, physical discovery of thousands of flash-frozen mammoth remains still found buried deep within the Siberian mud today. The cultural memory also retains the distinct architectural signatures of this lost era. The central sky deity in Buryat tradition, Esagay Malan, commands a highly advanced heavenly pantheon, often associated with vivid descriptions of a technologically superior ruling class. These surviving legends continuously reference the legendary builders of brilliant white stone cities. This deeply ingrained cultural motif likely references actual, highly advanced medieval civilizations like the Kingdom of Balhae, which developed massive industry and complex urban infrastructure across the vast Manchurian region between the years 698 and 926. The recurring motif of terrifying fire from the sky also possesses a deeply grounded physical reference point. On June 30th, 1908, the massive Tunguska explosion unleashed a catastrophic meteoroid airburst that instantly flattened 2,000 square kilometers of dense Siberian forest. To alternative researchers, such catastrophic astronomical events are viewed as deliberate atmospheric scours utilized to fry the pre-existing global energy grid. These physical events violently reinforce the generational trauma recorded by the surviving steppe nomads. The digital resurrection of Tartaria. You would assume a lost global civilization buried deeply by time and powerful. Academic institutions would remain safely hidden away forever. For well over a century, the formidable gatekeepers of mainstream academia successfully controlled the entire historical narrative by strictly managing access to the physical archives. Then the internet arrived and fundamentally democratized all historical inquiry. The new digital age abruptly handed a high-powered magnifying glass directly to the masses, completely bypassing those traditional institutional choke points. The initial genesis of this modern grassroots rediscovery actually traces all the way back to the mid-1970s. A Russian mathematician named Anatoly Fomenko published a highly controversial framework, widely known as the New Chronology. He utilized complex celestial mechanics to forcefully argue that the entirely established timeline of human history was a massive, deliberate fabrication. This radical foundation was later aggressively expanded by Nikolai Levashov, who introduced highly potent esoteric elements to the narrative, presenting Tartaria as the true, suppressed identity of a glorious ancestral realm. For decades, these theories remained isolated within highly specific regional circles. However, Around 2016, these concepts were rapidly divorced from their original framing and instantly internationalized. A massive viral explosion occurred across major digital platforms. Entire decentralized communities materialized overnight on Reddit, specifically within dedicated forums like Our Cultural Layer and Our Tartaria. Simultaneously, TikTok algorithms blasted visually stunning clips of deserted mid-19th century streets and massive architectural anomalies to millions of screens worldwide. Armed with these fragmented narratives, a new generation of digital investigators turned to modern, high-resolution mapping technology. Independent researchers now aggressively utilize widely available tools like Google Earth and advanced commercial satellite imagery to hunt for what they identify as vast geometric scars etched directly into the planetary surface. They eagerly point to the impossibly perfect star shapes of massive fortifications and the highly complex, mathematically precise grid patterns of modern cities. They argue fiercely that these sprawling structural foundations are actively being re-excavated from the hardened mud, rather than being newly built by primitive early settlers. Mainstream archaeologists and urban historians push back heavily against this rapidly growing digital phenomenon. They clarify that these undeniable geometric scars are not the ghostly remnants of a buried global empire, but rather the highly deliberate outcomes of logical, orderly Enlightenment city planning. Professionals point directly to fully documented historical blueprints, such as the 1792 L'Enfant Plan for Washington, D.C., to conclusively prove that these precise geometric layouts were systematically designed and executed by known architects. The battle over the truth of our ancient past is no longer fought in dusty library basements, but directly upon the high-resolution digital maps, the sediment of lost history. The true power of the Tartaria phenomenon extends far beyond a simple debate over architectural anomalies or old maps. It represents a profound cultural manifestation of our growing collective discontent with modernism and a fierce, outright rejection of established institutional authority. At its core, this movement forcefully challenges the rigidly linear official narrative forced upon us by mainstream academia. Adherents find it entirely illogical to accept that human society progressed directly from rudimentary horses and buggies to sudden, massive global industrialization without the crucial presence of a highly advanced precursor civilization. When faced with the sheer scale and monolithic construction of 19th century urban infrastructure, many find it far more rational to believe humanity simply inherited these grand structures rather than building them from scratch using basic buckets and spades. This deep skepticism effectively frames the entire Industrial Revolution not as an era of glorious human progress, but as a calculated Great Reset designed to deliberately erase a vastly superior past. If this suppressed global inheritance were proven true, it would instantly undermine the historical legitimacy of nearly every modern state. It fundamentally frames contemporary nations and academic elites not as stewards of human progress, but as ruthless usurpers of a stolen golden age. However, this profound historical skepticism carries highly dangerous modern consequences. Expert analysts carefully observe that while the foundational theory appears driven by genuine architectural curiosity, it is increasingly being hijacked for aggressive political purposes. Far-right ethno-nationalist factions, heavily utilizing platforms like the Tartaria Britannica website, actively reappropriate this narrative to support highly toxic Great Replacement ideologies, falsely arguing that invading forces systematically exterminated an ancient, pure bloodline.